The sun was setting behind the hills when Eli Turner rode into the small town of Dry Creek. His hat was pulled low to shade his eyes, and the dust from the trail covered his old boots. Eli had spent most of his life working cattle and mending fences, but the years had made him quiet and distant. He lived alone on a small ranch at the edge of the desert. Once he had a family, but sickness took them away, leaving only silence behind. Now his days were filled with long hours under the sun and lonely nights beside the fire. That morning, he came into town only to buy supplies: flour, salt, a bit of coffee. But as he tied his horse outside the trading post, he noticed a crowd gathered near a wagon. The sound of laughter and harsh voices carried through the air. Eli walked closer, curious to see what was happening. A man stood beside the wagon, shouting prices. Inside sat a young woman with dark hair braided over her shoulder. Her hands were tied and her clothes were torn from travel. She looked tired, scared, and alone. The auctioneer called her an Apache woman, said she was pregnant and being sold for work. The crowd laughed cruelly, making jokes that stung like arrows. Some said no one would want her. Others said she was nothing but trouble. Eli's eyes met hers for a moment. She didn't beg, didn't cry. There was a deep sadness there, but also something else, a quiet strength. It struck Eli in a way he didn't expect. He looked down at his boots, then reached into his pocket. Without saying a word, he pulled out a few silver coins and placed them on the table. The laughter around him grew louder. Someone shouted, "Eli Turner's lost his mind." Another man said, "Guess he's tired of talking to cows." Eli didn't answer. He only waited for the auctioneer to hand him the paper. Then he walked to the wagon, untied the woman's hands carefully, and helped her down. She looked at him, unsure whether to trust him, but he simply nodded toward his horse. They left the town behind as the sun dropped lower. The road to Eli's ranch was long and quiet. The woman sat behind him on the horse, holding the saddle with one hand and her belly with the other. Her name, he learned, was Naya. She didn't speak much English, and Eli didn't know her language, but silence worked just fine between them. At sunset, they reached the ranch, a small cabin surrounded by open land. Chickens clucked near the fence and 2 old cows grazed by the barn. Eli helped Naya down from the horse and led her inside. The cabin was simple: a bed, a table, a small fireplace. He pointed to the bed for her to rest and laid his blanket by the fire for himself. That night the wind howled outside. Naya lay awake, listening. She had expected pain, harsh words, or punishment, as others before had given her. But Eli said nothing. He kept to himself, adding wood to the fire, making sure she was warm. In the morning he made a pot of coffee and cooked beans. He placed a bowl on the table for her, then sat quietly across from her, eating his own meal. Naya hesitated at first, but hunger won, and she began to eat. Eli noticed how thin she was and realized she needed rest more than work. Days passed in the same quiet rhythm. Eli went out to the fields and tended to his animals, while Naya stayed near the cabin, helping where she could. She began sweeping the floor, washing dishes, and feeding the chickens. Her movements were careful, as if testing whether it was truly safe here. Eli tried to speak to her using simple words and gestures. He pointed to things, saying their names slowly: water, fire, food. Sometimes she repeated them, her voice soft but steady. When she smiled for the first time, just a small, unsure smile, Eli felt something inside him ease. In town, people were still talking. They called him foolish for bringing an Apache woman home. Some said he'd lost his mind. Others said she'd run off soon enough. Eli ignored them all. He'd lived too long to care what others thought. Every man carried his own loneliness, and this was how he chose to face his. One afternoon, Eli found Naya sitting outside, her hands resting on her stomach. She looked tired but peaceful. He noticed how she watched the horizon, like she was searching for something she had lost long ago. He brought her a small wooden chair he'd made and set it by the porch. She nodded in thanks. It became her favorite spot, where she sat every evening watching the sky turn gold. As time passed, the baby's arrival grew closer. Eli began preparing things the best he could. He found some old wood scraps in the barn and built a small cradle. It wasn't perfect, the edges were rough and the paint peeled, but it was made with care. When Naya saw it, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. She touched the wood gently and whispered something in her language, maybe a prayer. One evening, dark clouds rolled in over the valley. The air turned cold, and thunder rumbled far away. Eli went out to secure the barn doors, but as he stepped inside the cabin again, he heard Naya call out softly. She was gripping the table, her face pale with pain. Eli froze, realizing what was happening. The baby was coming. He didn't know what to do. Panic rushed through him, but he forced himself to stay calm. He boiled water, tore up clean cloth, and knelt beside her. The storm outside grew louder. The wind howled, the rain beat against the roof. But inside the cabin, only the sound of Naya's labored breathing filled the air. Hours passed. Eli did everything he could to help her, speaking gently, wiping sweat from her forehead, trying to give comfort in a language they both barely shared. He had never been more afraid in his life, yet something inside him told him to keep going, to not give up. Finally, after what felt like forever, the cabin filled with a new sound, a baby's cry. Eli sat back, his hands trembling, unable to believe what he was hearing. Naya held the tiny child close, tears streaming down her cheeks. The firelight flickered across her face, and for the first time Eli saw her smile fully, freely. He turned away for a moment, blinking back tears he hadn't felt in years. The storm outside began to quiet, the thunder fading into the distance. He looked at the mother and child and realized that the cabin no longer felt empty. For the first time since losing his family, the air inside was warm again, not from the fire but from life itself. That night, Eli sat by the hearth, too tired to sleep. Naya rested with the baby beside her. Outside, the rain fell softly over the land. Eli thought about how strange life could be, how a simple trip to town had changed everything. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew one thing for sure. He would protect them no matter what anyone said. As he watched the fire burn low, he whispered to himself, "You're home now." And for the first time in years, he meant it. The first light of morning crept through the cracks of the cabin as Eli Turner opened his eyes. The storm had passed, leaving behind a calm silence broken only by the soft cry of the newborn baby. Naya sat near the fire, holding the child close, her dark hair falling gently over her shoulders. Eli watched her quietly, unsure what to say. He had faced wild horses, angry storms, and lonely nights, but this moment felt different. It was fragile and new. He walked to the table and poured her some warm water. She smiled weakly and whispered a word of thanks. Eli nodded, his throat tight. The baby's tiny fingers moved, curling around Naya's hand. Eli had never seen anything so small and alive. For years his world had been empty, filled only with work and silence. But now a new sound filled the air, a sound of life, of hope. Over the next few days, Eli cared for them as best he could. He cooked, brought in wood, and made sure Naya had enough rest. The baby, a boy, was healthy and strong. Naya named him Samuel, after a name Eli had once mentioned from his family Bible. It sounded soft and simple, and Eli liked the way she said it. Naya recovered slowly, and her strength began to return. She helped Eli around the cabin again, moving carefully so as not to wake the baby. When she smiled, it brought warmth to the small home. Eli found himself waiting for that smile each morning. Sometimes they sat together in silence while the baby slept, listening to the wind outside. But life was not easy for them. When Eli went into town to buy supplies, the whispers started again. Men outside the saloon laughed when they saw him. "He's got himself an Apache wife now," one man sneered. "Bet the kid's part savage too." Others joined in, but Eli kept his eyes forward. He paid for his things and rode back without a word. The next time he went to town, he found that some of the storekeepers refused to look him in the eye. People stopped talking when he entered the room. Eli ignored them all. He had work to do and 2 people depending on him now. Back at the ranch, Naya noticed the change in him. She asked softly if the townsfolk had been unkind. Eli shook his head, not wanting to worry her. Doesn't matter, he said simply. They'll learn. The days grew longer and the baby began to laugh and make small sounds. Eli built a wooden cradle that rocked gently. He was proud of it, though his hands were rough from years of ranch work. Naya watched him sand the edges smooth, smiling as she hummed a tune from her childhood. The house that had once been cold now felt alive. When spring came, wildflowers covered the hills. Naya loved walking outside, the baby wrapped in a soft cloth against her chest. Eli often followed a few steps behind, keeping watch. She showed him the plants her people used for medicine, teaching him their names in Apache. He tried to repeat the words and she laughed at his awkward accent. Slowly, a friendship grew between them, a bond that didn't need many words. At night, Eli told her stories about his parents and the ranch. In return, Naya spoke of her tribe, of the land she once called home, and of the family she lost. Sometimes her voice trembled, but Eli never interrupted. He listened with quiet respect. Over time, she stopped speaking of the past with only sadness. There was something new in her tone, acceptance, maybe even peace. Months passed and Samuel began to crawl, filling the small cabin with his giggles. Eli and Naya worked side by side, planting vegetables and tending animals. The townsfolk still whispered, but some began to change their tone. When Eli helped a neighbor mend his fence after a storm, the man thanked him sincerely for the first time. People saw that Eli's ranch was thriving, and that the woman everyone had mocked was gentle, kind, and hard-working. One cold winter, sickness swept through the town. Many fell ill, and the doctor couldn't reach everyone in time. Eli heard about it from a traveler and decided to help. He and Naya gathered what food and herbs they could spare. Naya remembered the plants her mother once used to heal fevers. She mixed them carefully, showing Eli how to boil them into tea. Together they rode to town with baskets of medicine and soup. At first, people were hesitant to accept help from Naya. But when one of the preacher's children recovered after drinking her herbal tea, word spread quickly. The same people who once mocked her now knocked on Eli's door for help. Naya never turned anyone away. She moved quietly from house to house, tending to the sick, whispering prayers in her soft Apache tongue. Eli watched with pride. The woman everyone had doubted had become the one they now depended on. Slowly, the walls of prejudice began to crumble. When the sickness finally passed, the townsfolk gathered at the small church to give thanks. Eli stood at the back, holding Samuel in his arms, while Naya sat quietly beside him. No one laughed this time. People greeted her politely, offering words of gratitude. For the first time, she was seen not as an outsider, but as someone who belonged. As months turned into years, life on the ranch grew steady. Samuel learned to walk, then run, chasing chickens and laughing as Eli pretended to scold him. Naya taught him her people's songs, and Eli taught him to ride. The boy had his mother's dark eyes and his father's quiet strength. He was the heart of their world. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, Eli and Naya sat on the porch watching Samuel play. The golden light bathed the land, and the air was filled with the soft sound of crickets. Naya turned to Eli and said, "You are not lonely anymore." Her English was still broken, but her meaning was clear. Eli smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. "No," he said quietly, "not anymore." He reached over and gently took her hand. They didn't speak after that, but the silence was full, warm and peaceful. In that moment, both knew they had found what they had been missing for so long: a home, a family, and a sense of belonging. The years continued to pass, and the story of the lonely cowboy and the Apache woman spread across the valley. Travelers spoke of their kindness, of how they had built a life from nothing and proved that compassion was stronger than fear. When Samuel grew older, he became known for his honesty and courage. People said he carried both his mother's spirit and his father's heart. He often rode beside Eli to help with ranch work, and Naya watched them from the porch with quiet pride. One summer evening, Eli stood near the fence, watching the land stretch far into the horizon. The same land that once felt empty now felt alive with laughter and love. Naya walked up beside him, and together they stood in silence, their hands brushing lightly. The sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Eli thought about how it all began. The day he saw her in that wagon, frightened and alone. He had only wanted to do what felt right. But that single choice had changed everything. It had brought warmth to his home, life to his heart, and peace to his soul. He turned to look at her, and she met his gaze with the same quiet strength he had seen in her eyes that first day. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. Everything they wanted to say was already understood. As the evening shadows deepened, Samuel ran across the yard, his laughter echoing through the valley. Eli lifted him up, spinning him in the air, and Naya's laughter joined in. The sound carried over the land, mixing with the soft wind, a song of hope and new beginnings. The lonely cowboy was lonely no more, and the woman who had once been treated as nothing had become the heart of his world. Together they built a story that would be remembered for generations, a story not of wealth or fame, but of kindness, courage, and love that crossed every boundary. And as the stars appeared above the desert sky, Eli whispered a quiet prayer of thanks for the woman who changed his life, the child who gave it meaning, and the peace that finally filled his once empty home.